Welcome to Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Phil Bezanson.
And we are your host, as well as partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigation, and enforcement actions. Phil, who do we have on our show today?
So today we're going to talk about 4 different perspectives about the same thing, government investigations. And we're going to do this from the point of view of a prosecutor, from SEC enforcement, from outside counsel, and from the point of view of an in-house lawyer. And because we love multitaskers and we only have budget for one guest, we are relieved that we can get all 4 perspectives from our good friend, Shamoil Shipchandler, who's here with us today. So Shamoil has been a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Texas, a law firm partner, the director of the Fort Worth Regional Office of the SEC, and he's now the chief counsel of risk and regulatory affairs at Charles Schwab. As we'll get to later, he's also a law professor, and for a time at least, he was running the SEC's Fort Worth Twitter account, and during his control, he was able to turn that account into a social media celebrity. So thanks for joining us today, Shamoil.
Well, guys, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Nothing says I'm dealing with skilled practitioners than your ability to take my checkered past and my inability to hold on to a job and turn that into a positive. So thank you for doing that.
Well, it's all part of being a defense lawyer.
I don't really have the budget for anyone else either, so...
No, I would imagine that if I canceled out on you, that would represent 4 cancellations, which I made sure that I wanted to keep this commitment for sure.
We appreciate it.
So in talking about government investigations, which are candidly a big, broad, and varied kind of thing, you have lots of different perspectives now. And I think many of our listeners and many people sort of colloquially out in the world think of government investigations as something criminal and the FBI showing up at your door early in the morning and there being stern wood-paneled courtrooms and people going to prison. But we all realize that government investigations represent quite a few different things. And in its most basic form, they can be both criminal in nature and civil in nature. So I think it would be interesting just to hear you talk a little bit about the differences between the two as backdrop for how we may approach these things from the variety of perspectives that you enjoy.
Yeah, I'd even throw one more in for you, Phil, and talk about the fact that a lot of this stuff deals with internal investigations also. So, I mean, if you can have investigations that are initiated by the government, but all too often you have internal investigations that turn into government investigations as well. So when you're talking about complexity, you've got all kinds of complexity in all manner of different approaches. So what I would say that
or government investigations that are sometimes done by the internal counsel, right?
It depends on who you ask, right? So I imagine that if you ask the government, they would say, we don't actually have the internal investigation run by anybody other than the government. But that gets into a little bit of case law issues that the government has had in the past. But I think the core difference, Phil, is I would treat them from the perspective of whoever is being investigated. I tend to think about them in much the same way. You're after the same kind of thing. You're after the end result is you're trying to figure out what went wrong. And what went wrong can be criminal. What went wrong can be civil. Sometimes what went wrong can be both of those kinds of things. And so I tend to think of the mechanism by which you do these. A lot of those things are going to be relatively the same. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest difference would be the criminal sanction is much more severe, right? It is the true hammer in the system, whereas the civil sanctions have a lot more flexibility in the resolution. And so I tend to think of the mechanism as being the same, but the end result as being markedly different.
So Shamoil, you've come at this from so many perspectives, right? I mean, you've done investigations as a federal prosecutor. You ran the SEC office in Fort Worth, and then you've handled them in private practice, and then now you're in an in-house role. I mean, what are some of the common mistakes that you see happening over and over again in more of what I would say white collar type investigations?
Yeah, so I'll have to, it's funny, I'll have to sort of split myself into parts and think about them because they're all a little bit different from depending on where I've been. I think that from a government perspective, when you're operating as a prosecutor and you're looking things, I think one of the key things in that interface between sort of the private sector and the public sector is the fact that the government initiates an investigation and they don't know anything. Right. The reality is that they're getting sources of information that funnel into whatever they're trying to do, but they don't have any idea. So the things that you as counsel or you in-house think of as reflexively, oh yeah, we got a policy on that or a procedure. These are the right people to talk to. Remember, the government has none of that information. And so all of their requests for information at the front end are going to be necessarily enormously broad, right? You'll get a subpoena, for example, or you get a request with a whole bunch of different information in it. And you'll be thinking on the receiving side, oh my gosh, like that's 100 different questions asking for thousands or millions of documents. What am I supposed to do? But really the answer is that when you don't have any grounding, you actually have to figure out what it is that you're looking for. And so I think initially from the government standpoint, it's really helpful when people stand up and say, let me help you shape your investigation. Like, I understand what you're after. These are the kinds of things that would help advance the ball. And in order to do that, building that trusted relationship and remembering that yes, it's an adversarial proceeding, but doesn't have to be an instantly antagonistic proceeding is a really important part. On the other hand, on the company side, it's important to kind of marshal your resources together, right? And in order to answer the questions in a systemic and quick way, all the while balancing the idea that you're trying to execute business, you're trying to actually continue to do the things that keep the company operational. So there's a tension there between becoming sort of a cost center that's diverting resources and trying to resolve an issue that could be significant. So I think the perspectives are different, but really it comes down to this idea of sort of scope and answering questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from an in-house perspective, you touched on this maybe perception of a conflict between the government saying we run an investigation and private practice law firm lawyers saying, well, actually, I'm going to run the investigation, or an in-house lawyer saying, well, really, I'm going to run the investigation. So when it comes to sort of shaping the scope of what an investigation is going to look like, who really gets to be the final arbiter, and how do you get to figuring out who's the final arbiter of what an investigation might look like?
Yeah, so the true final arbiter in any kind of a conflict situation is going to be the entity that's got subpoena power. So yeah, if the entity can march into court with a broad-based subpoena and say, like, you have to comply, and your only ability to quash that subpoena is going to be unreasonable or out of or irrelevant, and the baseline is you don't get to know what they're investigating, and you know that the power of a grand jury, for example, includes the ability to satisfy itself that no crime has occurred. Ultimately, the government gets to decide that kind of thing. But there is a reality here in that the government doesn't want to go on kind of an unlimited fishing expedition either. And that doesn't do anything for its ability to kind of look at the truth and marshal its resources in a way that makes sense. And so I think while it bears the ultimate responsibility to do things, the government investigation is largely shaped by those two sides, by the private lawyers who are helping to run an investigation and by in-house counsel. And working together on those in shaping the investigation, I think, is the most important part. And I think the relationship is that the private lawyers on a private law firm get to say, in our experience, we've done a lot of investigations, and in our experience, this is kind of what the government is looking for. This is how we advance the ball and get there. On the in-house side, you need to make that a reality. And so it's access to documents, access to people, access to information that you provide. And then you also have to shape kind of what is and is not a proper scope, right? What makes sense. And that is done really in conjunction with the perspectives of outside counsel. That's the hardest thing in my mind, is the scope of an investigation. If it's too narrow, if you do something too narrow, you don't ask the obvious questions that the government would ask, then you lose credibility. But on the other hand, if you create a scope that's enormously broad, all you'll be doing is investigating for years. And that damages the inner workings of a company and damages relationships.
And that's one of the reasons why it's important in my experience, and I'd like to hear your perspectives on this, and is establishing that type of communication with the government up front. It's here's what we're going to investigate, and here's generally how we're going to go about doing it, and building that trust and relationship. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I agree. And I agree 100%. I've seen you both in action. So, Matt, you've been opposite the SEC when I was there, and Phil, we've been side by side on things before, and I've seen you both execute that technique. And I think that makes sense, right? It makes sense for it to be. I mean, the bottom line for a company is, in many ways, investigations are going to be things that are going to be subject to some level of scrutiny. And at least being open with the government to suggest that these are the kinds of things you're looking at and allowing them to have input, that really helps the matter. Because if at the end of the day, if the investigation is a complete black box, the government investigation is a complete black box, that may not be the most efficient way to resolve your matter.
So one of the things that's probably a self-serving question to ask here is, you talked about internal investigations as a component of the scope of investigations as a whole. And I imagine many internal investigations are things that are dealt with, just like it sounds, internally, with inside counsel and inside support staff managing sort of the full beginning scope of the investigation. At what point, though, do you think there are indicators that say, oh, you know what, maybe it makes sense to call an outside lawyer and bring in an outside lawyer because of some aspect of this investigation?
So that's a great question. And unfortunately, you typically have to rely on the Supreme Court's definition of pornography and say something like that. I know it when I'll see it. But the reality is that you do know when you see it, right? When it appears that an internal investigation is either going to have the appearance that it's not a independent investigation, or there's sufficient indications that there's something significant there that you need an independent view, that's probably where you refer to outside counsel. For example, when I'm thinking of if you've got individuals in management who are have been identified as individuals who may have information, that might suggest that you have outside counsel conduct interviews or look at information because the topic would be incredibly sensitive. And so those are the kinds of issues, or if you have something that you think might need to end up being a self-report to the government. You know that what the question the government's going to ask is whether or not there was an independent investigation. If you are able to foresee down that path, then you may know you need to get counsel involved. So I think in many ways, it's really looking at the investigation itself and thinking, is this an investigation that could use a truly independent viewpoint, and being able to execute from there. And many times the legal department is an independent viewpoint, but there are circumstances where it might not be perceived as such.
And I know this is something that goes maybe one step beyond that, but many companies, certainly public companies, have boards of directors that may want to get involved or may need to get involved with an internal investigation or an investigation that starts purely as an internal matter. Is there any sort of indicator that whether it's bringing in the board first, bringing in outside counsel first, bringing them in at the same time, any pornographic suggestions about how to bring in a board of directors?
I'm not even sure how to respond to that question because now this whole thing has taken a vaguely uncomfortable turn.
He just wanted to say the word.
I wanted to say it to get an uncomfortable answer from you.
He was just sitting there. How do I fit this into a question? He didn't even remember the question.
Yeah,
and clearly nobody in here would ever suggest that using this definition is appropriate in any way, shape, or form. But anyway, but no, you're right. The board of directors has a role, right? And their role is to govern certain aspects of how a company is handling certain sensitive issues. I think for the most kinds of internal investigations, a report back as to what's going on is what you really owe. The depending on the sensitivity of it, that's what you owe the board of directors, so they can acquit their responsibilities of oversight. But you're right in suggesting that something that has all the indications that it's a significant matter that you need an independent viewpoint. That independent viewpoint might very well be the board providing the guidance to the company about how to handle an investigation. And so certainly there are circumstances in which the board of directors would create a special committee. The special committee would operate that investigation. And that way they have unfettered access to whatever they need and no perception that there's any kind of an interest that's guiding it other than to find the right answer. So certainly there are instances like that. I think actually the reverse example would be almost as helpful in some ways, because I know I could use it for an educational session of my own. When do you suggest to a company that they should get the board of directors involved in order to handle something when you've been brought in on an internal investigation that's being governed by management?
Usually if you're investigating senior management, that can, especially of a public company, that can impact it, right? Because either they're signing financial statements or they're giving reps to companies' auditors, matters that may impact the financial statements of the company. That's going to need to be escalated. And certainly then, the auditor is going to want to get involved, and they're going to want to know it's being investigated, probably by outside counsel for a whole host of reasons. Phil, you probably can think of other examples.
I agree with that. I think maybe to approach it slightly more broadly than that, it's any time you're investigating something where you realize you're going to have to notify some entity outside the organization, it strikes me as a safe thing to do, to say, well, you know what, if someone outside the organization is going to learn about this matter, we should probably make sure the board knows about it first, because I think it's probably not a great thing for anyone involved, for a board of directors to find out about some type of investigations being conducted of an organization in which they're a board member from someone other than the organization. That may not be a strictly legal black letter law definition of how to go about it, but it's certainly a safer approach for keeping important stakeholders informed and allowing important stakeholders to weigh in if they so choose.
You identified two things, right? I mean, thing number one would be the idea that the board needs to have knowledge of what's going on. And so, the idea of no surprises, right? To make sure that things are previewed for the board and what's happening and how it's going. But the second piece is, when do you cede control? So I think both of you kind of operated on both of those areas, right? I think, Matt, you gave some examples of when you would actually cede control and say the board should run this investigation however it sees fit. And Phil, you gave the example of making sure you keep the board informed as to what's going on. That calibration of what you inform them about is important, right? Because at any point in time, you could have little minor details as to how a termination of an employee occurred, all the way to bigger issues of like, how do we account for something? So there's all kinds of gradations of things that you are handling at any one given time, and figuring out what you should and should not talk about is an important piece.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I suppose is a cap of sorts to the comment that I made is, companies conduct internal investigations about all sorts of things all the time, and I mean they can be in areas that will almost certainly have nothing to do with any potential government enforcement matter or criminal matter, and those kinds of internal investigations probably are not ones that merit that kind of planning for board disclosure, but things where there is an element of potential criminal exposure, regulatory enforcement exposure, other high profile exposure that would have to ultimately be disclosed somewhere publicly. That's kind of the framework that I would work through in deciding when and how to notify a board.
The other thing I've seen, and Shamoil, I don't know if you've seen this, at least the landscape on the private side, is there's the other area that a number of clients I see often is I'm going to have to pull punches here. In other words, they're the internal investigator, and because of the dynamics of that company or the dynamics of who they report to, they have that feeling of, I think I'm going to have to pull some punches here in my investigation. And there, you may not even have something that's impacting the financials. You may not have something that ultimately needs to get reported out, but there needs to be a mechanism where the staff who's doing that internal investigation internally can say, listen, I can't really be fully independent here. We need to get someone else involved.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you think about all investigations, right, the whole point of an investigation, broadly speaking, is a truth-seeking function. That's what you're after. You're after get to the bottom line as to what happened. And part of that truth-seeking function is deciding what to look at and who to talk to. And you don't want to go too far, and you don't want to do too little. So anytime that truth-seeking function is compromised, I think it's a good place to have a little bit of self-reflection.
That's a great way to put it. So I want to put you on the spot here, but I'm looking for a good story from an investigation. One you either oversaw on the government side, or one that perhaps you saw in private practice. Of course, no names policy here.
So you're looking like sort of an investigative policy kind of thing?
Yeah, like an investigative, just great story that we could share with our one listener.
Is that whose mom is that? Phil, is that your mom?
Totally my mom.
Yes, right. I knew it. That's what I thought. Not even the kids, huh? That's just tragic.
My kids are too young both to understand and to have the content of this podcast be suitable for their ears.
Well, you two talking about pornography so often.
I don't blame me for that. That's just that I was trying to go highbrow in Supreme Court. So I'll give you two examples that come from a time at justice, right? Like every trial has its own story, but sometimes every investigation has its own story as well. I was handling a public corruption case with a public official, and we were getting very, very close to the statute of limitations. We had, I think, 24 days until the statute of limitations would expire. And we had received the case literally that close to the end of the statute of limitations. So our investigative tools were incredibly limited, right? We wouldn't, even if we issued a subpoena, the first thing that happens when you issue a subpoena is that somebody asks for more time. And so we issued the subpoena 30 days and bang, we're gone with our statute of limitations. And so what we did instead is we, from the government standpoint, we said, given these limited tools, I think we just have to really swing for the fences and see what happens. So we approached a couple of people who we thought might have some connections to that public official. And that was in day, I think, 22. By day 20, the public official panicked. We had wired up somebody in order to gather information. And the public official described in great detail in a conversation how he had accepted bribes, the format of those bribes. And anytime they were going to talk about the bribes, they were going to use coded language and talk about it in terms of scripture. So we had not only the conduct, but we had the decoder ring. And so that conversation about a plea took about 4.5 minutes when we handed the transcripts over as to what happened. So that would be one example. Another example would be when sometimes we think about federal agents as being in some ways ubiquitous, right? They're everywhere. They know everything. They're all kind of, they all have the same procedures to follow. We ran a search warrant on the house of somebody who was alleged to engage in money laundering activity. And they secured the house. They called me back and said, we've got a bunch of vehicles we've seized. We're going to take them over to the lot. And I said, great. Where's the guy? And they said, oh, he's not here. We're going to go locate him. At the same time, my second line rang and it was a lawyer saying, hey, the guy's in the house and can we talk to you? And I said, look, I have on really good authority that he's not in the house. My agents are there right now. And I'm flipping back and I'm saying, hey, listen, the lawyer just said he's in the house. And they're like, he's not in the house. We've searched the house. We've secured the house. So I go back to the other line. He's not in the house. And the guy's like, look, can we just have your agent stand down because I'm really sure he's in the house? I'm like, what is happening over here? Going back and forth between the lines. And it just so happened that the guy had a cell phone and was in the attic. And so we managed to get the information, but everybody makes mistakes would be the lesson that I would say. It didn't end up compromising the investigation, but I wouldn't assume that everybody knows everything that's going on at any given moment in time.
That's a fantastic example. Phil's looking over his questions to see if we have anything else.
Studying me intently.
Yeah. I'm
going to keep backing up.
Phil may have a lot of questions. He's trying to figure out which ones are appropriate.
No. You know what? It's actually something that had just occurred to me a moment ago that again is sort of a broad, open-ended question that, since you have all these different perspectives and have, seen things from a lot of different points of view, is there something that you wish could happen with how investigations get run that you'd love to see tried, but has never happened? And you just have an idea about this would be great to see happen, but no one does it. And you have no idea why.
Yeah. What I would say is I wish there was more. I wish there was more creativity. And what I mean by that is and I'm going to take a really simple example. I'm going to take the DOJ, for example, right? The DOJ criminal division has a variety of different tools at its disposal. They can do virtually anything. But what you find is often prosecutors will approach it from the standpoint of conviction or no conviction. And so that spectrum of options that you have is not the best spectrum of options. And it involves the most severe sanction all the way to nothing at all. And so one of the things that I always thought, even when I was at Justice, is that there should be more on that spectrum of possibilities that a prosecutor can consider, and you should be able to open that tool belt to allow for those possibilities. And so it's not just the idea of a conviction or no conviction. It's not the idea of just a DPA or an NPA or something like that. There's more along that spectrum that they can do. If they were to use more of those tools, I think they could kind of get to a place where they're more cooperative with large companies, small companies, and change behavior on a broader scale. Because it's all if you get a conviction for a company, oftentimes you'll read the press release and you'll be like, oh well, that's not my company, or that's not my conduct, that doesn't represent me. Or an individual, for example, being convicted of a Ponzi scheme. It's like, well, I don't run a Ponzi scheme, that's not it. But that doesn't take into account a lot of the other conduct that you can see along the way. And so in many ways, I think that idea of having the conviction and issuing the press release doesn't have the ripple effect and the deterrent effect that you would want to see. Instead, if you saw companies kind of engaging more into a partnership with DOJ saying, hey, listen, we've seen this conduct. We don't like this conduct. We'd like you to address this conduct. These are the ways in which we think other places have addressed this conduct. You'll see a lot more kind of response in the industry to adhere and align those policies together. I think the FCPA world went that way when it was doing declinations. Because what it did is not only did it decline, it gave a rationale for declinations, which allowed companies to say, ooh, we could fall into that boat. We should probably change our practices. That is far more effective, I think, than looking at a company who's convicted of bribing, because it's easy for another company to say, that's not us. So
Right.
the creativity aspect, I think, is where I really see it more often. It's creativity in resolution. It's creativity in timing. It's creativity in approach. It's all of those things.
Yeah, and it seems like there's at least some attempt to do some of that. In the DOJ and SEC have put out guidance, for instance, on how companies should structure their compliance programs. And, and that seems to be, for me, it's particularly helpful when I'm talking to my clients, because I can say, listen, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a pretty well put together piece of guidance from the government. And they're saying the exact same things that we've all been saying for years on, what are the hallmarks of a good compliance program? And it seems that is making inroads and is being effective in companies.
It's getting there, right? It's getting there. But I think the easiest thing to do, and I'm going to take off my government hat and all whatever hats I'm wearing at this point in time. I'm going to take them off and I'm going to pose it to Phil. So Phil, how much credit am I going to get if I self-report a violation to the SEC? I'm asking for 10, 20%. What's my reduction? What's my number?
Oh, you won't be told that up front.
No, of course not. Of course not. You have to report first and then trust that to happen, right? And so it's elementary concepts of how you engage are not there, right? That's really hard. If your best encouragement is that look at our seaboard factors, that doesn't help as much.
Well, then look at the guidance that DOJ antitrust put out. Must have been 15, almost 20 years ago at this point, where they actually said for horizontal antitrust violations, if you are the first in the door, you get you get full refund. You don't get penalized. If you're the second one in the door, well, that's not the best, but it's still pretty good. So you're also going to get a reduction. But if you're after second, forget it. You're toast. It actually it's remarkable to me that model hasn't been tried, at least not tried more publicly, with a whole bunch of other, multi-party potential enforcement matters where, you could get results closer to what we're talking about here if something like that was tried.
Yeah, for me, I say, what's the downside? I mean, really, at the end of the day, what is it? What is the harm that you're trying to solve is the fact that you're encouraging companies to come forward, because then by encouraging companies to come forward, you erase that tragedy, the commons, whatever you do kind of gets pushed out to the industry, and you see better, whatever that better is, you see better. And clearly what they're doing right now isn't changing sort of what's been done before. So why not take a chance? Why not do something different or interesting? So that's kind of what I think about. It's there's some elementary questions that would make that I don't know why they go unanswered, for so long. A question that's sort of ripe for today is should you or should you not pay ransomware?
Right.
And the government will not. They will not answer that question.
Well, we're getting much closer to you shouldn't. I mean, it's not quite there quite explicitly yet, but putting out guidance that you may violate OFAC, you may violate AML rules if you make a ransomware payment. That's a pretty bright indicator, because one of the key characteristics of a ransomware payment is you often have no idea where it's going. So how do you know you're not violating OFAC rules? How do you know you're not violating some AML rules? It's an injected risk that I think everyone has to deal with in a ransomware environment.
It is. The question is that without because of all those mays and maybe not and possibilities and all of those kind of things, those are all kind of down the road questions, right? Yeah. The immediate question for most entities is, how do I survive?
Yeah. How do I continue to operate?
And I think it's just, these are the areas that I think are areas in which I don't know that it matters what the answer is, but the guidance would be helpful.
Oh, right. For sure.
Yeah. I mean, and there, I've heard a number of government officials say, essentially, you should pay ransomware. But then I think there's this evolving thinking, as you mentioned, Phil, about because so many foreign actors are the ones that we think are behind the ransomware. But why can't the government say, listen, if this is impacting your company, let's have a program where you can escalate this and get this resolved, because it can have the impact of, for instance, shutting down the supply of gasoline to a significant portion of the country if you don't do it.
Yeah, and the cybersecurity landscape is a really fun and interesting one from a theoretical perspective, because the issue that you run into is almost like the overlapping responsibilities that all the agencies have. And so on a typical cybersecurity incident, you've got DOJ that's interested in the perpetrators who did it. But you turn around and you have the SEC or others interested in the company's conduct. And so it's hard. It's interesting to find other areas of the law in which the victim's conduct can result in a sanction along with the perpetrator's conduct. That is an interesting place to be.
Well, particularly because the victims are a whole lot easier to find than the perpetrators.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And that's the wrong result, right? I mean, how are you going to punish someone who is trying to operate their business and is the subject of a crime, but yet you're going to punish them?
Well, but it's close, right? I mean, like you can see the argument, right, Matt? Because it's like you're right that there has to be a threshold level before you punish somebody. But what if you've got an entity out there that collects a bunch of information and does nothing to protect it? Like clearly that's a bad actor, right? Like clearly that should be something that's held accountable, but there are gradations along the way. And if you think about the evolving landscape of cybersecurity, it's driven heavily by like the plaintiff's bar, right? And what constitutes a new standard of conduct? What is the appropriate measure to take? Well, is that appropriate? Right? Is that appropriate given the fact that all these companies have different resources to apply to the problem or any of those things? So it's really, it truly sets it up to be like a law school hypothetical. Just asking these questions and thinking about this and how to navigate it is really interesting.
Yeah. And, in that you raise a good point, but like in that context, I think, the civil system is set up and there's, if there's someone's data that is stolen, let's say in the, like in a Home Depot type scenario that we saw a number of years ago, the civil system is going to take care of that. It's set up, and we see it every day, how many lawsuits are filed over even the hint of any kind of impropriety.
Yeah, yes and no. Like the civil system will handle parts of it, but so far it's been very difficult people who are the individuals who are the victims of a breach to qualify for class certification. And so they might have one-off ability to capture whatever they want to, and what they might capture might be smaller, but the class that would typically drive behavior might be a little bit different. So I don't know. It's funny. Like in class, I've posed these kinds of questions. Like they're perfect exam questions because there isn't a right or wrong answer, and so the analysis matters. But I can almost guarantee you that we could go through this whole exercise and talk about this analysis, and we would probably come to a different conclusion at the end. We would all have our own perspectives as to what's the right answer, which is really interesting, right? Because then it suggests that this gray area is something that maybe the government shouldn't regulate because it isn't a black and white issue. So I don't know where that goes. I mean, that kind of leads us to an inconclusive point. We're supposed to talk about things and like wrap it up with a nice bow. This is sort of an unraveled, half-chewed bow.
But if you're the professor, then at the end, you're the final arbiter of whose analysis is best. And that usually puts you in a pretty comfortable position, right?
It puts me in a great position since I'm not one taking the exam. But the bottom line is like whatever conclusion you reach, as long as your analysis is pure, doesn't make a difference. So that's the hardest thing about grading exams, right? Is like if somebody comes to the wrong answer, but their analysis is correct, that's kind of like what law is. So it's like you got the wrong answer, but you really thought about it in the right way.
And that is a great way to tie this up.
In our little bow.
As our producer comes on and tells us to wrap it up.
So thank you, Shamoil, for joining us today.
Yes.
This was great. We loved having all of your different hats on and hearing your different points of view on the government investigation and internal investigation issues that we discussed. For our listeners, this has been Sidebar, which is available at bracewell.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you find your podcasts.